And welcome to Bookends online edition and in person, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyteller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Bookends programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, November 12th, 2022, excuse me, at 11:30 via Zoom, and will feature Linda Lagarde Grover and her book, and excuse me if I mispronounce, Gitchigami Hearts, Stories and Histories from Misabikan. We'll go with that. This month, Margaret Shaw Johnson will talk about her book, The Haunting of Potter's Field. The book is a series of stories about people from the 19th and early 20th century. They worked hard to achieve the American dream, but sometimes the obstacles they faced proved to be too much and they failed, dying poor, often alone, ending up buried in a potter's field. Margaret Shaw Johnson, author and playwright, is a graduate of the University of Minnesota School of Journalism and William Mitchell College of Law. She served as a trial court judge in Minnesota's 3rd Judicial District for 21 years. Her experience gives her a unique understanding of the hardships and struggles of ordinary people. Her heartfelt compassion and realization that fate can undo any of us shows in her storytelling. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them in the chat or just go ahead and raise your hand and let us know. Now, let's welcome to Bookends Online Edition, Margaret Shaw Johnson. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. And welcome, everybody. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here, and I'm so glad that you came. It's nice to see people coming out after getting a little bit of a breather from the pandemic. So I'm honored to be here, and I thank the Historical Society and all of you for inviting me to come. Well, just in time for Halloween, The Haunting of Potter's Field is about a cemetery and a host of dead people just aching and moaning to tell their stories. But these stories are not really ghost stories. Instead, they're stories about people who lived a long time ago and died more than 100 years ago, mostly. But they were people like you and me, people who had hopes and dreams of their own. They wanted to succeed in this new territory of Minnesota. But unlike the lumber barons and the railroad men and the bankers, these people's dreams were not realized. They were hardworking people, many of them, with 1,000 talents, but their dreams simply fell flat. In a land of winners and losers, these were the losers. These were the losers, so much so that they ended up in abject poverty, and they could not even afford a burial site. They ended up in Potter's Field, which was the free burial area for people who were desperately poor. Most of the graves did not have markers, sometimes just a couple of sticks lashed together, sometimes not even that. I'm from Winona, which is a small town in the southeastern corner of the state. And in Winona, we have a beautiful 19th century park cemetery. And I walk there because it's simply a beautiful place to walk. And it's so strange because there are areas of the cemetery that have these huge obelisks where all the rich people are buried. And right near that, there's a field. So beautiful meadow with wildflowers. This is where Potter's Field is. And as I would walk by, I'd see little stones, and I couldn't help but wonder, who are these people? Sometimes a stone would have a few initials etched on it, sometimes not. And I just wondered, who are these people? What are their stories? Does anyone know, and does anybody care? It turns out that in that meadow, there are more than 2,000 people buried in Winona's cemetery. Those are 2,000 stories that have been lost to history, mostly. It is the winners that tell the story of our history. But aren't these stories equally important if we're going to know the whole story of what it took to build this country? These were people that formed the labor backbone of our community, people who tried, who struggled, and did not succeed. I decided to try to find out some of the stories about these people. But how do you research when you don't even know a name? So I had to get kind of creative. And in Winona, we're fortunate. We have Winona State University, and we have an online, we have a newspaper archive. So it's an online searchable database of old newspapers. And so I started out just by searching Potter's Field, and I came up with quite a lot because I wasn't searching by name. I was searching more by circumstance. So for example, say somebody had died say somebody was killed, somebody was murdered. They would obviously write about the murder, but if the victim was a poor person, they would also say something like, Billy Jones happened into town, 2 years ago. We don't really know his name, but he didn't have any money, and we couldn't figure out who his people were, and so we buried him in Potter's Field. So all of a sudden, I would have Billy Jones' name, and I would have a little bit more to go on. People who were others, people who were regarded as strangers to the community, also drew public attention. So, for example, there's a story about a Chinese laundryman and an American Indian were buried in Potter's Field. But the reason their stories were there was because there was something curious to the local population about their burials. So there were rituals that were performed at the gravesite that the newspapers just loved to write about. So then I knew about their stories a little bit. In one case, a small boy was killed in an accident, and it was particularly tragic, but more so because his parents had been taken right to the ground during the Depression and could not even afford a burial site or a headstone for him. I don't want to give you an impression that these are all desperately sad stories. Some of them are amusing, some of them are actually heroic. And not everyone who's buried in Potter's Field was a hardworking victim of circumstances. There's no shortage of crooks and con men. A lot of people just passing through whose names we never did know, or whose real names we didn't know. It was amazingly easy to disappear at that time. People could just leave and create a new identity for themselves, so nobody really knew who they were. Some of them were running from somewhere to anywhere. Some were trying to escape the law. Some were running away from debt. Some were trying to escape family obligations that they didn't want. Surely there are a lot of bad guys in Potter's Field too. But I think these stories taken together give us a clearer picture of history in small town Minnesota during the westward expansion of the 19th century. And although these stories come from Winona, I consider them as representative of every small community in Minnesota. Your local cemeteries will have equally compelling stories. And I think it's worthwhile to look into them and try to find out what they are, because they tell us more about the broader picture of what happened during that period of time in our area. As Shelley said, I am a district court judge. It's a position that I held for 21 years, but I'm also a playwright. And this piece, The Haunting of Potter's Field, was not originally conceived as a book, but as a performance piece. So it was produced in Winona. Actually, it was produced as a collaboration between our small community theater and the Historical Society. We worked together and we put it on, and it was a fundraiser for both organizations, which was very successful because we got so many people in the community involved. The stories are written in verse because there are a number of them, and I wanted to fit the whole production into about an hour, so they had to be really compressed and very concise. Um, we used period music, so actors would tell the stories and sort of act out the stories. And then we had period music. Um, and also we got local musicians involved who actually composed pieces directly for the work. And there are a couple of those reproduced in the book. We had a modern dancer who stepped up and we used him in the production. And we got local school kids involved because we held a contest for children to design the program covers. And I have what they did. I have the programs here so you can see them today. I also have pictures of the performance if you're interested in looking at them. It turned out to be very popular, and it's something other communities could do. Oops, I lost my earring. Shoot. Well, I found it. So I would encourage you to do it here. You've got a small community group here. You could collaborate and do this work. It was very, very interesting, and it got so many different segments of the community involved. The problem with a play, it's kind of loud, isn't it? The problem with a play is when the curtain goes down, it's all over. And I love these stories. I didn't want them to disappear. So I decided to put them together in a book. It was not an easy book to produce. I knew because it was a visual piece, it had to be illustrated. And so I'm not an artist. I didn't know how to illustrate the book. So I looked online and I came across the work of a young man who was a graduate of the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And he's maybe 25 years old. And I kept looking at his work and I just liked it. I knew what I wanted. I wanted something that was beautiful, but also had sort of an edge to it, kind of a dark side, because it's kind of a dark subject. And so I got a hold of him, and he's maybe 25 years old. He's tattooed from here to here. He had big plugs in his ears, and I just loved him. You know, eventually we were such a strange couple. You know, it was the rebel and the granny doing a book together. We worked together for a year. I knew I had the right person when I ran across an interview that he had done with somebody online, and the interviewer asked him the question, have you ever considered illustrating a children's book? And he said, well, I don't think a child should read any book that I would illustrate. So anyway, we worked together really well, and he turned out, he also designed the book. He was just an incredible help to me, and it gave me a chance to interact with someone of that generation. He could be my grandchild. So it was really fun, and I really, really enjoyed doing it. So that is pretty much the story of the book and the production of the book. I'm going to read you just one of the stories, which is not very long. None of them are very long. If you can imagine this being done on the stage, it was a really interesting production. We had a good director and she brought it to life. So this is a true story. This man died in 1928. Old Mose was a codger, a revenue dodger, who wandered the streets of our town with no proper home. Our alleys he'd roam, hawking treasures that grew in the ground. He scoured the woodlands with skilled eye and deft hands, found mushrooms, the common and rare, mixed in stroganoff, earthy stew, rich brown broth. Moses' mushrooms were our special fare. On a cold autumn day, Billy Bronk went to play with his friend neath the town's eastern hill. saw a squalid old shack. At first fear held them back, when the moaning grew pained, loud and shrill. Found Mose on the looking poor, crumpled weak on the floor, to the doctor, a hospital bed. There he lingered a spell, he had stories to tell. The boys listened to all that he said. He started off with a smile, then he coughed for a while, sputtered, boys, if you'd known me when I was famous, you see. Oh, the wonder of me. Ah, those days, I would live them again. I've a musical soul. On the stage, I'd a role as Hernando, the vaudeville star. Oh, please, please lead our show. The world's best, you know, begged Ringling, the brash circus star. But I had my old troupe with a jolly old group with acrobats, actors, and band. We sang for our bread, drank too much, lost our head. Every town filled a tent. It was grand. Dusty roads through the West, tambourines, songs, and jest. We were happy, though ragged and broke. Then one day it was gone. Vaudeville lost its song, magic vagabond life up in smoke. So Mose ended up here foraging with the deer. Hernando, the vaudeville star. His last nickel was spent, money lost, money lent, bumming drinks from the guys at the bar. When he died, few to mourn, 'cause some held him in scorn, laid him down in a stark pauper's grave. In time, most forgot that he'd lived a lot in the music and song that he gave. When came summer's end, Billy went with his friend to his grave, talked of life on the roam. Then the mushrooms rose up, fleshy white, rosy cup. They would sell them when they got back home. And sell them they did. Housewives lifted the lid of the simmering mushroom pot stew, breathed the heady, rich scent earthy mushroom caps lent, reminding them of you know who. Now, mushrooms, you know, are just fungi that grow on loamy soil rich with decay. Their complexity fed by things that are dead, plants and fauna, dissolving away. So Mose had the last joke on those haughty townsfolk, folks who scorned him and looked down their nose. They enjoyed every bite, gourmet vaudeville delight, grave top treats spouted right from his toes. So here's the picture that Jared came up with. So that's pretty much the story. We had a reading at the Winona County Historical Society of the book when it came out, and we had some of Jared's illustrations enlarged for the reading, and then we sold them in the gift shop. So I had a few of them left, so I brought them, and I have pictures of the production. I'll put the book out here, you can look at it, and also the programs that the kids did. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Do you have any questions?
My my first question, which I should know the answer to, is did every town have a potter's field?
Every town had to have some place to bury people, that couldn't afford a burial plot. I think initially, well, I know initially people were just buried on the farmstead. As cemeteries grew, they still had to have a place. So whether they called it Potter's Field or they just carried it, they just buried them along the side or something. But I think most towns of any size have a Potter's Field, whether they officially recognize it or not.
There's a man that lives over near the Dent or in Frazee area that is researching and trying to attach a name or a little history to a potter's field in that area.
Really?
Could you repeat the question for the machine?
Okay. I'm just being told about a man who lives near Perham who is researching the history of people who are buried in Pottersfield in his area, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, I would love to know more about him.
I will try and find out.
Okay.
Pardon, Bob Reapy? Yes, Bob Reapy.
His name is Bob Reapy.
R-E-I-P-E.
R-E-I-P-E. Okay. Well, that's interesting. We would have something to talk about, Bob and I.
Did anybody in town keep records of who they buried in Pottersfield? Like if they knew the name or like male this age or female?
Well, we do. The question is whether anybody kept track of who was buried in Pottersfield. There are some records. In the beginning, the records were very lax, and it might just say one female, name unknown. Of course, a lot of babies were buried in Pottersfield. So there are some records, but they'd be very brief and very incomplete.
Is there a way to, like, I know some people do genealogy, like in cold case research through genealogy and DNA and finding records like that, or there's just.
Well,
little-
we'd have to dig them up. I don't think anybody will do that, but, and I think the question is really motivation too. We're not really good at caring that much about poor people. So, you know, it takes somebody like us, you know, who care enough to want to resurrect these stories. So, yes, ma'am.
So how did you get upon doing this in rhyme?
The question is, how did I hit upon doing this in rhyme? You know, it sort of came to me in rhyme. And also I knew if I was going to do it as a play, if I wanted to do a number of stories like little vignettes, they had to be brief. And so rhyme, you can really compress the language. You know, you're only using parts of sentences and, you know, running concepts together. So yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
Did you write all the poems?
Did I write all the poems? Yes, I did. Right. Yes.
You had said that you have humorous stories and you have heroic stories as well. Could you briefly share kind of like a one from each category? I mean, what would we put those in? Like, what would?
To me, it's funny. I don't know. I find it funny. Heroic. The story that I alluded to about the little boy who died. It's about how his family came to terms with his poor burial. Another one is a story about a man who died in Pottersfield, but his family thereafter became prosperous and didn't even remember actually that their ancestor was buried in Pottersfield. So, you know, that was pretty interesting. They thought they'd always been rich. You know, I mean, we all come from somewhere. We all come from somewhere, and it's not all prosperous people.
Do you have a favorite story?
I don't know. I like all of them. I think I love all of them. They're very dear to my heart. They really are.
How long did it take you for research? Like, get it, put it all together?
It was a process. Because I don't just work on this. I was also working as a judge, and I would find something and I would add it. So, you know, I've worked on this on and off for years, really. But when I sit down to write, I can usually just write it straight through. But I have to, you know, I have to do the research. And actually, when I wrote the book, I revisited some of the stories that were in the play and realized, like, for example, well, I realized that I didn't have the whole story, so I found more. So the rest of the story is in the book that wasn't in the play. So I'd like to go back. I'd like to do more research on Pottersfield. I'm very motivated. So, but I've written and produced 2 other plays since this too.
So Potter's Field, is that just specific to Winona, or is Potter's Field the general
It's a generic
for-
term, and it goes all the way back to the time of the Bible. Yes, it's when, the Bible says, that Judas was paid, okay? And he tried to refund the money then after Jesus died to the priests. And they used it to buy a burial plot for people outside of the community, which was Potter's Field. And they think that Potter's Field, it was said that way because it was unproductive land that was probably clay, that people excavated the clay to make pottery. So it's an old term, and there are Potter's Field all over the country. Potter's Fields all over the country.
Did you find that a particular group was more represented, like were there more men, more women, more children?
Did I find that a particular group was more represented? I found a lot of immigrants. So I think a lot of people that came with nothing, people that were built out of their money by con men, people who were, they had a hard time because they didn't speak the language, for one thing. So I think they were pretty disadvantaged in that regard. There was no social safety net at that time. There was no social security. If you lost what you had in your pocket, you didn't have anything, and that was it. So I'd say immigrants. There were immigrants from all over the country. Mostly in our area, it was mostly Germans and Polish people where I came from. But I found, my goodness, all over the place, all over the place. And that was an illumination. We tend to think that we're German and Polish in Winona, but there were all countries represented to one extent or another.
Seems to make sense though, when you think about it, a lot of families, if they didn't have a lot of money, the old country would say, well, just have one person here first to get started and then slowly bring everybody else over. And things that work out for one person, they're here without family.
Right. I think if you do buy the book, and that would benefit your historical society, one of the most interesting stories to me was the Chinese laundrymen. These people were brought from China to build the railroad that transfers the country. But then there were laws passed that forbade them from working except in very limited occupations, one of which was laundry and the other which was restaurants. And so a lot of them tried to move farther east and establish laundries or restaurants throughout the country. And I had no idea that there was a Chinese laundry in Winona. And that to me is a very interesting story about the man's death and what happened. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. So
I was just thinking, it's a pity we've got a couple of people here experienced, and we can do an impromptu reading, a dramatic reading.
Well, you've got all the talent, you've got all the talent right here.
In a tangential, I actually have an ancestor that is was deliberately buried outside of the main cemetery in an unmarked grave because the local Catholic priest did not approve of said ancestor. And my relatives have been hunting for that grave for a while now, like 20 years.
Right. That's a tragic but interesting fact. A lot of times, well, especially we have 2 cemeteries in Winona. So there's the public one, an interdenominational one, and then there was a Catholic cemetery, and some religious groups would not bury, for example, an unbaptized person in hallowed ground, in blessed ground, or if somebody was, was a criminal, would not be buried there. You had to be buried outside of the blessed ground. So that was another way that Potter's Fields were used. Yes, ma'am?
I watched a program on public TV recently from the Veterans Home at Fergus Falls. And he was talking about all the unmarked graves that they have of people there. And he commented so many of them were immigrants who had no family to back them up or to help them. And they just died and were buried anonymously.
Right.
That's close by.
There's a scene in the play based on a true circumstance where an old couple just sort of wandered in the town. Now, we are probably 30 miles from another town called Rushford. We're in Winona. And this couple had been talked out of their money in New York. Somebody met them when the boat came in and said, I'll change all your money. And so they gave him the money, leaving them just enough money to get on the train. And of course, what he gave them was false money. And so they got as far as Winona. They didn't have any more money. And there wasn't any railroad going to Rushford where they wanted to meet up with somebody. And the last we saw of this old couple was they asked directions to Rushford, and they just started walking through the fields. I don't know, it just breaks my heart, You realize how vulnerable people were, how terribly vulnerable.
Since Winona is in the southwest?
Southeast.
Southeast. Okay, so then it was not touched by the Dakota War in 1862?
Well, not directly, no. I mean, I think obviously it impacted everybody, but yeah.
So I was wondering if any Native Americans were buried in the Potter's Field.
The Native Americans in that area were at the time, the Winnebago, now the Ho-Chunk, and also the Ojibwe. So, So anyway, I found one incident of a Native American man being buried there. And it's in the book because it was unusual. They lived in encampments along the river. We're right on the Mississippi River. So they lived, and that's where they buried their people. But there was one Native American man that I found buried in Potter's Field. Yes.
Do you think you'll continue this work? Do you think you'll write something else altogether? Do you think you're done writing? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in revisiting this. I think it's valuable work. But I've got a lot of other projects that I'm working on too. I'm a big arts advocate in my town, working on restoring an old theater, on 2 or 3 city committees, trying to, garner support for the arts. So, yeah, we just finished a Mother's Day play that was really fun. So that was great. It was performed in May. That was my last one.
Did I hear that you went to school for journalism?
Yes.
But you're a judge.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
How did I become a judge
Yeah.
after starting out as a journalist? Well, I graduated from journalism school, so I've always been a writer. And I worked for a short time as the advertising manager of the assistant advertising manager of a large Minneapolis company. But I was not in that position long because, as usual, a man disrupted my life and married me and whisked me away. And he was in the military. So we moved to Italy for 5 years, and my children were born there. And when I came back, all my connections were gone. So I went to law school. So, yeah,
Small kids.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I had toddlers. It was hard. Yeah, well, it worked out.
I don't think that it's easier though, because you're not sleeping anyway.
This is true. This is true. Yeah.
Sounds like that would be an interesting story too, though, being American living in Italy.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. I just got back from Italy 2 days ago. I still go back a lot. Yeah. So, well, thank you.
Maybe one more before you leave.
Let's
This
see.
is a little boy.
Yes, I could read about the little boy. Let's see, where are you, Donald? He grinned at his hunch as he skipped home for lunch that his ma had baked fresh apple pie. He was 7, carefree, living life happily, a gap-toothed, freckled-faced little guy. Donald, his pa, little brother, and ma lived together down road from the school. Pa toiled for his pay, got them through day by day. Work hard and waste not was their rule. There was no time to swerve as it sped round the curve. Little boy took the taxicab's blow. It was over so fast, Donald's short life had passed. I can hardly read these. Leaving sorrow no family should know. Parents wept, brother cried, their sweet Donald had died. His gravesite must honor his life. Potter's Field grave was free, thus a fine stone was key. He will have it, Pa promised his wife. So he bought it on time, every week paid a dime. They installed it, engraved. It looked grand. It helped just a bit to take picnics and sit with their Donald like holding his hand. The depression grew deep, Pa's debt burden steep, missed payments like losing his soul. Bank said, you'll not pay, take that fine stone away. Wrenched it out of the earth, left a hole. All his hope drained away, endless toiling each day. His son was gone, life lost its light. As he sank in despair, his youngest took care. I will help, Papa, let's make this right. So they gathered up sand, cement, all by hand, made a form from a broken down crate. Poured a slab, flat and thick, they inscribed with a stick, little Donald's initials and date. In Potter's Field still rests that slab on the hill with its memory of a small boy and a family's deep bond till death and beyond. They faced hardship with love, prayer, and joy. The end.
Thank you very much. It sounds like a very interesting book. There'll be some copies here for sale if people are interested, or you can get them at the Wadena Historical Society, right? At the gift shop.
Liner, what are the gift shop hours these days? I'm sorry. What are the gift shop hours these days? Oh, 10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday.
10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday at the Historical Society, or you can order them through Travel and Story Seller. All right, well, thank you so much. And thank you guys all for coming. And of course, you're welcome to stay and have lunch. Sure. Yep.
All right, I neglected to say that the native tribes in Winona are also the Dakota. So
Okay.
I don't want to make that clear.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us at home and here. And we will see you next month.